An entire community vanished without a trace. In 1587, more than 100 men, women, and children arrived on Roanoke Island to establish England's first permanent settlement in the Americas. Just 3 years later, they were gone, leaving behind empty houses, a single word carved into a post, and a 400-year-old secret. By the end of this journey, you will know all the leading theories behind this legendary American mystery, from scientific discoveries to shocking historical clues. We will explore what that one cryptic word really meant and why no rescue party ever found them. What does it take for an entire civilization to simply disappear? England was a nation desperate to catch up. By the 1580s, Spanish galleons were hauling immense fortunes of gold and silver from their empires in Mexico and Peru, while England had no permanent foothold in the Americas at all. Queen Elizabeth I saw this as a critical vulnerability, both economically and militarily. Her solution was to grant a charter to her favorite courtier, the ambitious Sir Walter Raleigh, tasking him with establishing an English colony. This was not merely about exploration, it was a calculated move in a high-stakes Cold War with Spain. The location Raleigh chose was strategically brilliant. Roanoke Island, just off the coast of what is now North Carolina, was positioned perfectly along the shipping routes used by Spain's treasure fleet sailing from the Caribbean. A colony there could serve a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a peaceful settlement, but its hidden role was to function as a base for English privateers, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, to raid Spanish ships laden with New World wealth. The entire venture was a gamble, funded by the hope of treasure and the dream of an English empire, all resting on the shoulders of the 117 colonists who sailed into the unknown. That first colony was never meant to be a peaceful home. Sir Walter Raleigh sent 108 men, most of them soldiers, under the command of a hardened veteran named Ralph Lane. Their mission was not to farm or build a community, but to secure the land as a military outpost and prepare for the arrival of future settlers. From the very beginning, their survival depended entirely on the generosity of the local Secotun people, led by a chief named Wingina. Initially, the relationship was cautious but cooperative. The English traded metal tools and trinkets for the corn and fish that kept them alive, but this fragile peace was built on a foundation of mutual misunderstanding. The Secotun saw the English as powerful, if strange, potential allies against their own rival tribes. Lane and his men, however, saw the native people as subjects to be commanded, their resources there for the taking. As the months dragged on, the English supplies dwindled and their demands for food grew more insistent. The once friendly exchanges turned tense, then hostile. Wingina, realizing these strangers were becoming a permanent and dangerous burden, began to move his people and their food supplies away from the English fort. For Lane, this was not an act of self-preservation, but one of betrayal and warfare. In a desperate and brutal preemptive strike, Lane and his men invited Wingina to a meeting. When the chief and his advisors arrived, the English attacked them with swords and guns, killing Wingina and decapitating his body. This single act of violence shattered any possibility of peace, leaving the colonists completely isolated and surrounded by people who now saw them as murderers. Starving, besieged, and with no relief ship from England in sight, their situation was hopeless. Then, as if by a miracle, the silhouette of a vast fleet appeared on the horizon. It was not their supply ship, but the famous privateer Sir Francis Drake, returning from raiding Spanish ports in the Caribbean. He offered them food, supplies, and even a ship to stay. But before they could even transfer their supplies, a massive storm hit the coast, damaging the offered ship and scattering Drake's fleet. Seeing this as a final sign, the entire colony, battered and traumatized, accepted Drake's offer of passage and abandoned Roanoke. They left behind an empty fort, a legacy of bloodshed, and a warning for any who would follow. England was not ready to give up on its American dream. Within a year of the first colony's failure, a new and very different group set sail. This time, the expedition was not made up of soldiers but of families. 117 men, women, and children, led by the artist and newly appointed Governor John White, aimed to build a true, permanent home they called the city of Raleigh. Their goal was not to raid Spanish ships but to plant crops, build houses, and raise the next generation of English subjects on American soil. This was a community complete with carpenters, farmers, and their wives and children. Among them was Governor White's own pregnant daughter, Elena Dare. Just a short time after their arrival, Elena would make history, giving birth to a baby girl named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child known to be born in the Americas, a powerful symbol of the colony's intent to put down deep and lasting roots. Her birth must have filled the settlers with immense hope, a sign that their new life was truly beginning. Yet this hopeful beginning was unfolding on an island still haunted by the violence of the previous colonists, a place where the local people had every reason to distrust the English. The stage was set not for a simple story of survival, but for one of history's most perplexing mysteries. Their new world revealed itself as a harsh and unforgiving place from the moment they stepped ashore in the sweltering July heat. The 117 colonists, exhausted from their long voyage, faced an immediate and desperate struggle for survival. Their supplies, already diminished, would not last long. The grand houses and fertile fields they had dreamed of building were nowhere to be found. Instead, they were confronted with the overgrown ruins of the old military fort, a silent and haunting reminder of the conflict that had poisoned this land just 2 years earlier. Their first and most urgent task was to repair the crumbling structures and plant crops, but the growing season was already advanced and hunger loomed as a constant threat. Into this tense situation stepped the Croatoan people, a tribe who lived on a nearby island. They were not the same group that Ralph Lane had so brutally betrayed, a fact that offered a fragile sliver of hope. The Croatoan leader, a man named Manteo, had even traveled to England and learned some English, and he acted as a cautious intermediary. For a few short weeks, a tentative peace held. The colonists traded bits of metal and cloth for desperately needed baskets of corn and fish. But this cooperation was brittle, built on a foundation of profound mutual fear. The Croatoan remembered the violence of the previous Englishmen, and the new colonists carried the deep-seated prejudices of their time, viewing the native people with a mixture of dependence and suspicion. This fragile balance was shattered by a single, tragic mistake. A group of colonists, frightened and on edge, encountered a small party of Native Americans who were not Croatoan. In a moment of panic and misidentification, one of Governor White's men raised his gun and fired, killing a man. The horror of this act dawned on them immediately. The victim was not a threat. He was a friendly local from a nearby village, and his death sent a shockwave of anger and fear throughout the region. In an instant, the seeds of distrust sown by Ralph Lane's violence burst into full bloom. The cautious goodwill of the Croatoan evaporated, replaced by a cold and understandable fury. The colonists found themselves more isolated and vulnerable than ever, their fate now hanging by a thread in a land that seemed to grow more hostile with every passing day. Faced with starvation and hostility, the colonists made a desperate plea to the only man who could save them. They urged Governor John White to personally return to England to gather the supplies, reinforcements, and ships necessary for their survival. For White, this was an agonizing choice. It meant leaving behind his own daughter, Elena, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in this new world. To abandon his family in such a perilous situation must have felt like an unimaginable betrayal, a tearing of his own heart. Yet he was also their governor, and the logic was inescapable. He was the one most likely to succeed in securing help from Sir Walter Raleigh and the Queen. He was their only hope. With a heavy heart, he agreed. Before he set sail, the community made a solemn plan. They knew the situation was unstable. If they were attacked or their food ran out completely, they would have to abandon their settlement. They needed a way to tell White where they had gone when he returned. They agreed on a clear and simple signal. If they were forced to move, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a post, and if they were in any danger under duress, they would carve a cross over that name. It was a straightforward code, a lifeline of information meant to cut through the uncertainty of the wilderness. In the late summer of 1587, John White stood on the deck of a small ship, watching the fragile settlement and the family he loved shrink into the distance. He promised them, and he promised himself, that he would be back within a few months with everything they needed to secure their future. He could not have known that he was sailing away from a mystery that would endure for centuries and that he would never see his family again. John White's ship sliced through the Atlantic waves, every mile taking him further from his family and closer to the aid he promised to bring. He arrived in England with a desperate plea, a story of a fragile colony hanging on the edge of survival. But the England he returned to in late 1587 was a nation bracing for an existential fight. All of Queen Elizabeth's ambitions in the New World were suddenly dwarfed by a single, terrifying threat. King Philip II of Spain had finally lost patience with the English privateers who plundered his treasure fleets, and he decided to crush England itself. He was assembling the largest naval invasion force Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. This was not just a war, it was a battle for national survival, and every seaworthy vessel in England became a weapon of defense. The small ships Governor White had counted on for his rescue mission were immediately seized by the Crown, their hulls filled with cannon and their sailors pressed into military service. The private supply routes across the Atlantic vanished overnight. For John White, a man driven by a personal mission, this national emergency was a personal nightmare. He was trapped. He could only watch in agonizing frustration as months stretched into a year, then 2, then 3. He made frantic appeals to Sir Walter Raleigh and the Queen's advisors, but their attention and resources were consumed by the coming storm. The fate of 117 colonists, including his own daughter and granddaughter, was a tragic but trivial concern when the entire English nation was preparing for a fight to the death. The Great Sea, once a highway of hope, had become an impassable barrier sealed shut by the drums of war. 3 long years of war and delay ended when John White finally stepped back onto Roanoke Island in August of 1590. His heart must have been a tangle of hope and dread as his small ship sailed into the familiar inlet. He scanned the shoreline for any sign of movement, any wisp of smoke from a cook fire, any sound of a hammer or a child's voice. He saw nothing. The forest stood silent and thick. The sky was empty of any signal fire. The settlement, when it came into view, was a ghost town. The wooden houses they had built with such effort were still standing, but their doors hung open, swinging gently in the coastal wind. There were no people, no animals, no scattered tools. It was as if the entire community had simply dissolved into the air. The only sounds were the relentless whisper of the wind through the pines and the rhythmic crash of waves on the beach, a natural chorus that made the human silence even more profound. He walked through the abandoned compound, his boots crunching on dry leaves that had gathered in the doorways. Every empty home was a fresh blow. He was searching for a message, any clue they might have left behind, desperate for the coded signal they had agreed upon. And then he found it, carved deep into a wooden post at the entrance to the old fort. A single word, Croatoan. There was no cross, no mark of distress. Just that one name, clear and deliberate. It was the name of the friendly island where Mantio's people lived, a place of potential sanctuary. For a moment, a flicker of relief must have surged through him. They had not been attacked, they had moved, they had followed the plan, but that relief would have been cold and short-lived, chased away by a chilling new question. If they were safe with the Croatoan just a short sail away, then why had no one ever come back? The word was carved deep into the wood of the fort's main gatepost, the letters clean and deliberate. Croatoan for John White, this single word was a thunderclap of meaning. This was no panicked scrawl left in a rush, but a clear and orderly message carved with purpose. It was the exact signal they had agreed upon, a promise fulfilled in the most haunting way possible. The colonists had not been slaughtered, they had chosen to leave. They had packed their belongings and walked away from their homes, heading for the island of their Croatoan allies. And in that careful carving lay another, perhaps even more vital, piece of information. They had promised to carve a Maltese cross over the name if they were in danger or under attack. White's eyes scanned the post, the surrounding trees, every surface he could see. There was no cross. Its absence was as loud as a shout. They were not fleeing from an enemy, they were executing a plan. This crucial detail transforms the entire mystery. It shifts the question from a simple "what happened to them" to a far more complex and troubling one. If they left safely and with clear intent, why did they then vanish so completely from the pages of history? The answer, it seems, was waiting on Croatoan Island. But the post with its single word was not the only message the colonists left behind. As John White and his men fanned out through the empty settlement, a more complete and unsettling picture began to form. The houses themselves told a story of careful, unhurried departure. The heavy oak planks and beams had not been smashed or burned. They had been systematically dismantled, their joints carefully loosened, the valuable lumber methodically taken down and carried away. This was not the work of people running for their lives from an attack. An attack leaves wreckage, splintered wood, and signs of a desperate struggle. This was the work of people who were planning to build again somewhere else. People who saw their homes not as ruins to be abandoned, but as a resource to be packed up and moved. The most chilling evidence of all, however, lay buried in the dirt. The colonists, knowing they could not carry everything, had dug deep pits to hide their most valuable and heavy possessions, their iron-bound chests filled with tools, family heirlooms, and personal treasures. White's men found these chests. They had been dug up from their hiding places, their lids thrown open, their contents scattered carelessly across the ground. And here was the final, crucial clue. The heavy chests themselves were left behind, too cumbersome to move, but all the smaller, lighter, and more useful items were gone. They had taken only what they could carry on a long journey. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The colonists were not victims of a sudden massacre. They were participants in a deliberate, organized exodus. They packed their homes, sorted their possessions, and walked away from Roanoke under their own power, leaving a trail of clues that pointed directly toward Croatoan. So why, then, did they never send a single message back? Why did they disappear so completely after taking such deliberate steps to be found? For John White, the silent settlement was no longer just a historical mystery. It was a personal nightmare made real. He rushed past the empty houses, his eyes scanning for any sign of the three people who mattered most: his daughter Elena, her husband Ananias, and his granddaughter, the baby Virginia Dare. He found their home just as empty and still as all the others. And then he found their things. In the dirt, scattered and ruined, were the personal treasures he knew so well. A small chest that had once held Elena's keepsakes was broken open, its contents strewn about by the weather. Perhaps he saw a waterlogged book, a tarnished piece of jewelry, a child's tiny shoe left behind. These were not just lost belongings, they were fragments of a life he had left behind, now trampled into the mud. The governor was gone, replaced by a heartbroken grandfather standing alone in the ruins of his family's future. The single word Croatoan was now his only compass, pointing toward a desperate, fragile hope. He had to get to that island. He begged the captain of his ship to make the short sail south immediately. They had to know if his family was alive, but the Atlantic had one final, cruel twist to deliver. As they prepared to weigh anchor, the sky darkened to a bruised purple and the wind began to howl. A hurricane, one of the infamous storms that raked that coast, descended upon them with terrifying force. The ship was tossed like a toy in the raging sea, its sails shredded, its timbers groaning. The captain fought to keep the vessel from being driven onto the deadly shoals and shattered. There was no question of sailing to Croatoan. The only mission now was survival. Battered and defeated, the ship was forced to turn back into the open ocean and begin the long, sorrowful journey to England. John White stood at the stern, watching Roanoke disappear again into the storm-tossed haze, knowing he was leaving his family behind for the second and final time. He would never return to the Americas, dying years later with the fate of his loved ones forever unknown. That storm did not just strand one man, it sealed the fate of an entire colony behind a veil of eternal questions. Back in England, John White's story was met with a crushing official silence. The authorities accepted the evidence at face value. The colonists, they concluded, had simply moved in with the Croatoan people. There was no evidence of a massacre, no sign of a struggle. The official verdict was one of relocation, not tragedy. Yet this conclusion brought no comfort, for it raised a question no one in power was willing to answer. If they were living peacefully with a friendly tribe just 50 miles down the coast, why was no one sent to bring them home? The answer lies in a profound shift of priorities. By the 1590s, England's grand colonial strategy had changed. The war with Spain had drained the treasury, and the focus turned toward more promising ventures. The failed settlement on Roanoke was now seen as a costly misadventure. Sir Walter Raleigh, the colony's original patron, had his own fortunes and interests diverted elsewhere. The fate of 117 colonists was no longer a national priority, but a forgotten line in a ledger. For 2 decades, no serious effort was made to sail to Croatoan Island. The mystery was not so much unsolved as it was abandoned. John White lived out his remaining years a broken man, haunted by the ghost of a single word carved in wood and the faces of a family he could not save. He died in Ireland, never knowing what became of his daughter or the granddaughter who was the first English child born in the New World. With his death, the last living link to the colonists was severed, and the lost colony faded from public memory, becoming little more than a whispered legend. The word Croatoan carved into that post was more than a clue, it was a map. For centuries, the most compelling explanation for the colony's disappearance has been the simplest one. They did exactly what they said they were going to do. Facing a desperate shortage of food and the growing hostility of neighboring tribes, the colonists made a rational choice for survival. They sought refuge with the one group that had shown them consistent friendship, the Croatoan people on their island home, modern-day Hatteras Island. The logic is powerful and direct. This was the prearranged plan Governor White himself had agreed to. The lack of a cross carved above the name strongly suggests they left voluntarily, not under attack. And the location was not some distant mythical land. It was a known place, a relatively short sail down the Outer Banks. Imagine their situation. The corn from their first harvest was long gone. Their attempts to trade with other tribes had ended in violence and distrust. Every day that passed without John White's return was another day closer to starvation. The Croatoan, led by Manteo, who understood their language and customs, represented their only viable lifeline. It was a choice between almost certain death on Roanoke and the chance of life, however difficult, within a native community. The journey south to Hatteras would not have been easy, but it was achievable. They could have traveled in small boats or even walked along the shifting sandbars and islands of the coast, carrying their dismantled homes and salvaged tools with them. Once there, integration would have been the key to their survival. They would have had to learn new ways to hunt, to fish, to build shelters suited to the environment. The English men and women would have married into Croatoan families. Their children would have grown up speaking 2 languages, blending European and native traditions into a new, unique culture. Over a single generation, the distinct identity of the Roanoke colonists would have slowly faded, absorbed into the fabric of Croatoan society. This theory does not require a dramatic massacre or a fantastical journey. It simply requires us to believe that 117 people chose to stop being colonists and started being something else entirely. They chose to disappear not into thin air but into a new way of life. The silence of history can sometimes be broken by objects buried in the earth. Decades of careful archaeology on Hatteras Island, the ancient home of the Croatoan people, have yielded a collection of artifacts that speak volumes. These are not the treasures of a lost city, but the everyday items of a community in transition, and they point directly to the presence of the Roanoke colonists. Among the most telling discoveries is a small 16th century English signet ring made of a copper alloy. This was no mere trinket. A signet ring was a deeply personal possession, used to press a unique family seal into hot wax to authenticate documents. Finding one here on a remote island is like finding a single car key from a vanished vehicle. It suggests its owner was someone of some status, someone who had a name and an identity to seal. It is not something that would have been easily traded away or casually lost. More poignant still are the fragments of a writing slate, complete with a small hole drilled for a cord, the kind a child would use to wear it around the neck. This simple object hints at the colonists' desperate attempt to maintain their culture, to teach their children to read and write even as their world was transforming around them. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the context of these finds. These English objects were not discovered in a separate European-style settlement. They were found carefully mixed in with classic Croatoan artifacts, pottery shards, stone tools, and food remains, all within the same soil layers, the same hearth sites, and the same refuse pits. This is the archaeological signature of cohabitation. It is the physical proof of two communities living side by side, sharing their space, their tools, and their daily lives. A single gun flint found beside a native spear point tells a powerful story of blended survival, where Old World technology met New World knowledge. These artifacts do not suggest a brief, failed trade mission. They paint a picture of a slow, deliberate process of integration, where English settlers became part of the Croatoan world, their possessions gradually settling into the earth alongside those of their new neighbors, leaving a quiet but undeniable record of their ultimate fate. But the trail does not end on the windswept beaches of Hatteras Island. Another, even more profound possibility lies inland, carried for generations in the stories of a people who call themselves the Lumbee. Deep in the swamps and riverlands of what is now Robeson County, North Carolina, the Lumbee tribe holds oral histories that speak of ancient ancestors who are different. Their old stories tell of pale-skinned people who arrived long ago, speaking a strange tongue, people who integrated into their communities. These are not just vague legends. The Lumbee people for centuries have borne surnames that seem to leap from an English registry of the 1500s. Names like Locklear and Oxendine, Dial and Chavis are common among the Lumbee, and they bear a striking resemblance to the surnames found on the Roanoke Colony roster, names like Lockley and Oxwick. Even some of their unique words passed down through generations have a distinctly Elizabethan English flavor. This is not just a coincidence of similar sounds, it is a persistent cultural echo that demands an explanation. The theory is both simple and revolutionary. The colonists, after living with the Croatoan for a time, may have moved again, perhaps seeking more fertile land or fleeing conflict. A group of them, along with their native allies, migrated inland, up the rivers that acted as the highways of the ancient world. They would have traveled for weeks, eventually settling in the remote and sheltered swamplands of Robeson County. There, their descendants would become the Lumbee, a people with a unique blend of European and Native American ancestry, their origins preserved not in carved wood but in family names and the whispered stories of the old ones. This idea offers a powerful and human conclusion to the mystery. It suggests the colonists did not just survive, they thrived, and their lineage continues to this day. Yet this theory is not without its fierce critics. Skeptics point out a significant historical gap. The Lumbee do not appear in written colonial records with any clarity until the early 1700s, more than a century after Roanoke vanished. For those who demand documentary proof, this silence is deafening. Opponents argue that the English surnames could have been adopted much later through trade with other European settlers who arrived in the 1600s. They question why, if the Lumbee were the direct descendants of the lost colony, their oral histories were not recorded in greater detail by early English explorers. The debate is charged with more than just historical inquiry. It touches on identity, sovereignty, and the very nature of evidence itself. Is a story passed from a grandmother to a granddaughter for 12 generations less valid than a line in a ship's log? Can a name carry the truth of an entire people's origin? For the Lumbee, the answers are woven into the fabric of who they are, a living testament to a mystery that refuses to die. Yet the word Croatoan carved on the post may not have been a simple farewell. There is a much darker interpretation of that single word, a theory that replaces peaceful integration with a story of violent conquest. This hostile takeover scenario suggests the colonists never made it to their intended sanctuary at all. Instead, they may have been intercepted, captured, or systematically killed by a powerful and aggressive rival tribe. The most likely suspects in this grim narrative are the Chesapeake people to the north, or the even more formidable Powhatan Confederacy, a sprawling alliance of tribes led by the paramount chief Wahansenakor, whom the English would later know as Chief Powhatan. This chief commanded a vast territory that stretched from the Chesapeake Bay to the Carolinas, and he was ruthlessly consolidating his power, eliminating any potential threats to his authority. A band of strange, weapon-bearing foreigners settling on the fringes of his empire would have been seen as exactly that, a threat. Years after the Roanoke Colony vanished, the leader of the later Jamestown settlement, Captain John Smith, recorded a chilling and often repeated story. He claimed that Powhatan himself confessed to him, boasting that he had personally ordered the slaughter of the Roanoke colonists. According to this account, Powhatan's warriors attacked the settlement, killing every man, woman, and child. He showed Smith a handful of English-made iron tools, which he said were taken as trophies from his victims. Why would he do such a thing? The motive was brutally pragmatic. Powhatan was engaged in a long-running war with the very tribes the Roanoke colonists had contacted, including the Chesapeakes and potentially even the Croatoan. He could not risk these powerful strangers forming a permanent alliance with his enemies, providing them with European weapons and technology. From his perspective, the annihilation of the Roanoke colony was not a senseless massacre, but a calculated act of political and military necessity. He saw a potential enemy and he eliminated it completely and mercilessly. This theory offers a grim, closed-ended answer. It explains the total and permanent silence that followed the colonists' disappearance. If Powhatan's warriors descended upon them, there would have been no one left to send a message, no one left to tell their story. The single word Croatoan in this light could have been a desperate, unfinished message, or even a deliberate red herring left by the attackers to mislead any rescuers. It transforms the mystery from a puzzle of integration into a tragedy of geopolitics, where the colonists were simply pawns in a much larger native conflict, their lives extinguished to serve the ambitions of a powerful chief. Just when the mystery seemed lost to time, a new clue surfaced from an unlikely place. In the summer of 1937, a man named Louis Hammond was driving along a remote North Carolina road when he stopped to change a flat tire. His eye caught a strange, heavy rock in a nearby creek bed. It was not a normal stone. It was covered in carved writing, and when he cleaned the mud away, the message it revealed was staggering. It claimed to be a grave marker from Elena Dare herself. The inscription told a heartbreaking story. It's said that after John White sailed away, most of the colonists, including her husband Ananias and daughter Virginia, had been killed by local tribes. Elena, it claimed, survived for a time, carving her story into the rock before she too perished. This first stone was a bombshell, a voice from the grave seeming to solve the 400-year-old mystery overnight. The discovery ignited a frenzy. A California businessman named Emery Cobb became obsessed, funding a massive search that turned up more than 40 additional stones over the next few years. These stones, found across several states, wove an elaborate epic. They told of the colonists' long, tragic journey inland, detailing battles, hardships, and deaths. It was a ready-made saga, a lost history suddenly recovered, but the story was too good to be true. Scholars and journalists began to pick the stones apart. The later inscriptions were riddled with historical errors and used modern phrases that an Elizabethan woman would never have written. The carvings looked fresh, the grammar was all wrong. Investigators soon uncovered a simple truth. Local residents, eager for the reward money Cobb was offering, were carving the stones themselves and planting them for his team to find. It was an elaborate, cynical hoax, and the academic world dismissed the entire collection as a fraud. Yet a sliver of doubt remained. That very first stone, the one found by Louis Hammond, was different. It was found before the reward was widely known, and its carving style and mineral composition were unique, matching local stone. A few respected historians and geologists have argued for its possible authenticity, suggesting a clever forger simply could not have known the specific details it contained. So the question lingers, was the first Dare stone a genuine message from Elena Dare, a solitary truth in a sea of lies, or was it merely the brilliant opening act of an elaborate deception? The quiet persistence of names and stories now meets the precision of modern science. In the 21st century, the 400-year-old mystery of the lost colony has entered a new frontier, the human genome. A dedicated team of historians, archaeologists, and geneticists launched the Lost Colony DNA project, aiming to answer the question with a biological certainty that historical records cannot provide. Their goal is as straightforward as it is monumental: to collect and compare DNA from individuals in England who are documented descendants of the Roanoke colonists' families with the DNA of modern populations, particularly the Lumbee tribe and other Eastern Carolina groups. A single, verifiable genetic match would be the smoking gun, the long-sought proof that the colonists survived and left their mark in the bloodlines of today. Imagine the power of such a discovery. It would transform a legend into a documented lineage, finally closing one of America's oldest cold cases. But the path to that answer is a labyrinth of immense scientific and historical challenges. The first and most profound hurdle is the sheer passage of time. 4 centuries of population growth, migration, and intermarriage have diluted any original colonial DNA to a tiny fraction of a modern person's genetic makeup. Finding a distinct genetic signature from just 117 people after so many generations is like trying to isolate a single drop of ink from a vast and ever-flowing river. The project also faces a heartbreaking absence. Without any physical remains from the colonists themselves, there is no baseline, no pristine source of DNA to compare against. The scientists are working backwards, using living descendants in England as a proxy for their lost ancestors, hoping to find those same unique genetic markers in people across the ocean. Then there is the challenge of later contamination. After the Roanoke colony vanished, the entire region was settled by thousands of other English, Scottish, and Irish immigrants in the 17th and 18th centuries. Their DNA thoroughly mixed with that of the native populations, so if a Lumbee individual today shows European ancestry, how can researchers possibly prove it came specifically from a Roanoke colonist named Dare or Harvey, and not from a Scotch-Irish farmer who arrived 100 years later? It is a needle in a genetic haystack of monumental proportions, yet the search continues, a testament to the enduring power of this mystery. Each new DNA sample, each refined analysis, brings us one step closer to a truth that has been waiting in our very cells for centuries. Will science finally give a voice to the silent, or will the genetic trail fade into the same obscurity that swallowed the colony itself? While the search for human clues continues, another witness has been speaking for centuries, its testimony locked in the rings of ancient trees. The towering bald cypress and longleaf pines that grew near Roanoke Island have been keeping a meticulous year-by-year diary of the climate. Scientists can read this diary through a science called dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Each ring tells a story. A wide ring means a year of plentiful rain and robust growth. A narrow, pinched ring signifies a year of struggle, of hardship, of drought. By taking core samples from some of the oldest living trees and even studying preserved logs from that era, researchers have pieced together a climatic history stretching back 800 years. What they found was a staggering revelation. The entire period of the Roanoke colony's existence from 1587 through 1590 fell squarely within the most severe and prolonged megadrought the region had experienced in all those centuries. This was not just a few dry summers. This was a catastrophic multi-year event that would have crippled the very foundation of life. Think of the colonists' situation. Their survival depended entirely on two sources of food. The first was the corn they desperately tried to grow in their new fields. Corn is a thirsty crop, and without consistent, soaking rains, it withers and dies in the sandy coastal soil. The second source was the generosity of the local tribes who shared their own stored harvests, but this megadrought would have been devastating for everyone. The Powhatan and the Croatoan were facing the same environmental catastrophe. Their cornfields would have failed, their usual hunting grounds would have been parched, and the freshwater streams they all relied on would have turned to brackish, salty trickles as the Atlantic saltwater pushed further inland. The lifeline of trade that the colonists depended on would have been severed not by hostility, but by sheer, empty-handed necessity. There was simply no surplus food left to share. A single season of drought is a challenge. 3 consecutive years of it, at the absolute worst possible moment in history, is a death sentence. This environmental evidence reframes the entire mystery. The word Croatoan carved on the post may not have signaled a simple, planned relocation to a friendly village. It could have been the last act of a community shattered by an invisible enemy. Starvation does not announce itself with a war cry. It is a slow, quiet, and relentless force. Faced with the complete collapse of their food supply, the colonists would have had to make an impossible choice. Should they stay together as a large group on Roanoke, where they were all but guaranteed to starve, or should they break apart into smaller, more mobile bands to increase their chances of finding sustenance elsewhere? The single word Croatoan might not mean they all went to that one island. It could have been a designated rallying point, a message left for John White telling him where to begin his search after their desperate dispersal. Some may have indeed tried for Croatoan. Others, driven by thirst, might have traveled up the freshwater rivers into the mainland. Small groups weakened by hunger could have been absorbed by different tribes they encountered, their identities dissolving as they fought for daily survival. This theory suggests that the lost colony did not vanish in a single event, but faded away in a dozen different directions, scattered like dust by the relentless, dry winds of a changing climate. What if the word Croatoan was a carefully planted lie? A new theory suggests the colonists left that single, tantalizing clue not to reveal their destination but to conceal it. Imagine the pressure they were under. Hostile tribes watched from the mainland, and a Spanish ship had already sailed past, probing the coast for English settlements. If their enemies knew their true plans, they could be followed and wiped out. So they carved the name of a friendly, coastal ally, sending any potential pursuers on a wild goose chase south, while they themselves slipped away in the opposite direction. Their real destination, this theory argues, was the powerful Chowan River, a deep waterway leading into the resource-rich interior. The evidence for this audacious deception was hidden in plain sight for 400 years, waiting on a map drawn by the one man who knew the land better than any other Englishman, Governor John White himself. In 2012, researchers at the First Colony Foundation examined White's original watercolor map of the region using high-tech imaging. Beneath a small, layered patch of paper, they discovered a stunning secret. The patch had been used to correct a mistake, but the impression left on the paper underneath revealed a symbol no one had ever seen before: a large, star-shaped fort, carefully drawn on the west bank of the Chowan River, miles inland. This was not a small outpost, it was the symbol for a major fortification, a place intended for a significant number of people. Why would White hide this? The fort's location was a secret of immense strategic and military value. It sat in the territory of the Roanoke, a tribe that was both powerful and, at the time, potentially friendly to the English. This was a far more promising site than the exposed and barren Roanoke Island. The Chowan River Valley offered fertile soil for farming, dense forests for hunting, and a deep water port for future English ships. It was a place where a colony could actually grow and prosper, hidden from Spanish spies and safer from immediate coastal threats. The colonists, aware of this planned fallback position from their governor, may have executed the ultimate vanishing act. They left a false trail to Croatoan to ensure their enemies looked in the wrong place, while they traveled up the Albemarle Sound to the Chowan River, hoping to find the sanctuary and the future they were promised. This theory transforms the colonists from lost victims into cunning survivors, playing a desperate, high-stakes game of hide and seek with history itself. England's greatest rival was already waiting in the wings. Just a few hundred miles to the south, the Spanish Empire had established its own foothold in St. Augustine, Florida. For Spain, the very existence of an English settlement on what they considered their territory was an act of war. Spanish authorities had received intelligence reports about Roanoke, and they were determined to find it and wipe it from the map. A Spanish reconnaissance ship was indeed dispatched north along the coast, explicitly tasked with locating the English colony. We know from Spanish records that this ship actually reached the Outer Banks and sailed into the very inlet that led to Roanoke Island. But the captain reported back that he found the area deserted. He saw no one. What if he was lying, or what if he arrived at the precise, terrible moment the mystery was unfolding? The theory of a Spanish attack is chillingly plausible. A small, fast-moving Spanish strike force could have landed on the island, overwhelmed the weakened colonists, and taken them all prisoner. The Spanish had a well-established practice of capturing Protestants they considered heretics, often forcing them into slavery on their Caribbean galleys or in their Mexican silver mines. This would explain the complete absence of bodies or signs of a battle. A professional military unit would not leave a massacre site behind. They would take their captives and any valuable plunder and sail away, leaving the empty houses to tell no tales. The single word Croatoan in this dark light could have been a desperate, last-minute act of misdirection. A colonist seeing Spanish sails on the horizon might have quickly carved the name of a friendly tribe, hoping to send their pursuers on a false trail south while the colonists tried to flee or hide. Or more cynically, the Spanish commander himself could have ordered the carving after the fact, creating a red herring to ensure any future English search parties would look in the wrong place. If the Spanish successfully captured the entire population, it would have been a brilliant tactical victory, one they would have had every reason to keep secret. Announcing it could have provoked an all-out war with England that Spain was not yet ready to fight. So the colony and its people would have simply been erased from the official record, their fate becoming a state secret lost to time. This theory turns the mystery into a covert operation where the colonists were not just lost but were deliberately taken, their voices silenced by the geopolitics of a New World conflict. The most heartbreaking answer is often the simplest one. There was no grand conspiracy, no secret integration, and no dramatic battle. the colonists may have just slowly, quietly starved to death. The archaeological evidence of their organized departure does not necessarily mean they reached a safe haven, only that they tried. Imagine a small group, already weakened by hunger, setting out from Roanoke with their dismantled homes on their backs. They are heading for Croatoan Island, a journey of 50 miles through a landscape gripped by a catastrophic drought. The creeks they relied on for fresh water are now salty. The forests, usually teeming with game, are silent and empty. The corn they managed to grow on Roanoke yielded little, and the Croatoan people, facing the same environmental disaster, have no surplus food to share. Their bodies, already pushed to the limit, begin to fail them. They are also encountering a hidden, microscopic enemy. The colonists had no immunity to the pathogens common in the New World, just as the native people had no defense against European illnesses. Sickness would have spread rapidly in a group under such physical stress, a deadly combination of dysentery from contaminated water and respiratory infections in the harsh coastal climate. One by one, they would have succumbed. A child dies from fever, an elder collapses from exhaustion, a mother, too weak to go on, simply lies down and does not get up. The single, cohesive group that left Roanoke would have fractured into smaller and smaller bands, then into families, and finally into lone individuals, all desperately searching for food and shelter. The few who remained might have been taken in by different tribes out of pity, absorbed so completely into their new communities that their English identity vanished within a single generation. There would have been no large, traceable community for John White to find, only scattered survivors whose stories were lost when they themselves passed away. The word Croatoan was not a final destination, but a final, fading hope, a direction they set out toward but never reached as a whole. Their story ended not with a bang, but with the slow, agonizing silence of empty bellies and broken bodies, leaving behind only the wind to mourn them. The haunting silence of Roanoke has echoed far beyond the pages of history books, finding a fertile home in the landscape of modern imagination. This 400-year-old mystery has become a powerful narrative engine for storytellers, its gaps filled not with evidence but with supernatural dread and speculative fiction. The television series American Horror Story famously wove the colony into its mythology, transforming the lost settlers into a tribe of bloodthirsty, inbred cannibals living in the woods. In the world of supernatural, the disappearance was the work of a vengeful pagan god. Video games like Assassin's Creed and Fate Grand Order have cast the colonists as pawns in cosmic conflicts or as spectral figures trapped between worlds. Each of these fictional takes serves a similar purpose. They take the unsettling ambiguity of the real event and give it a face, a monster, a tangible villain to explain the unexplainable. The real horror of history, the quiet, creeping fear of starvation and isolation, is often swapped for a more dramatic, visceral kind of terror. This process of fictionalization does more than just entertain, it actively reshapes our collective memory. For many people, their primary encounter with Roanoke is not through a historical document, but through a horror story. The word Croatoan itself has been lifted from its original context as a possible map and transformed into a cursed incantation, a symbol of absolute and malevolent disappearance. These stories are not concerned with the nuanced theories of integration or drought. They feed on the core, chilling premise of the tale, that an entire community can be erased without a satisfying reason. While historians painstakingly sift through tree rings and pottery shards, popular culture offers a different kind of resolution, one where the mystery is not solved, but weaponized for maximum emotional impact. This cultural legacy proves that the true power of the lost colony lies not in what we know, but in the vast, terrifying, and creatively inspiring void of what we do not. This 400-year-old mystery holds us because it is not just a historical event, it is a human tragedy written in whispers. The presence of women and children transforms it from a failed military expedition into the loss of an entire community, of families with names and futures. We are not mourning soldiers, we are mourning a baby, Virginia Dare, who never got to grow up, and a grandfather, John White, who sailed away with a promise he could never keep. His personal anguish is our entry point into the story. We can all understand the terror of leaving a loved one behind, the desperate hope to find them, and the crushing despair of returning to an empty home. That single word, Croatoan, carved into the post is the ultimate tease. It is a clue that seems to answer everything, yet explains nothing. It is a door cracked open, but we can never step through it to see what is on the other side. This story endures because it is a perfect, unsolved true crime case, but without the grim finality of a crime scene. There is no body, no weapon, no definitive proof of what happened. This absence of an ending allows our imaginations to run wild, to build and debate a dozen different possibilities. It represents one of history's greatest what-if moments. What if John White had returned just 1 year earlier? What if that hurricane had never hit? What if those 117 people had survived to establish the first permanent English foothold, altering the entire cultural and political landscape of America before Jamestown or Plymouth were even conceived? We are captivated by the paths not taken, by the silent alternate history that vanished with them into the Carolina mists. So many paths lead away from that single carved word, each one a possible ending to the story. The colonists may have found sanctuary, peacefully merging their lives with the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island, their bloodlines and names echoing for generations in the Lumbee tribe. Or perhaps they fell victim to a brutal political calculation, massacred on the orders of Chief Powhatan to secure his empire. They could have been captured by Spanish soldiers and vanished into the hold of a slave galley, their fate becoming a state secret. The most haunting possibility is that they were simply broken by an invisible force, scattered and starved into oblivion by the worst drought in 800 years. While the integration theory remains the most logical, fitting the evidence of a planned departure and the lack of a distress signal, the complete and final truth died with them in the Carolina wilderness. The real legacy of the lost colony is not a solution, but a question that refuses to be silenced. It is the story of 117 souls who stepped into the unknown, a powerful reminder of the fragile line between survival and oblivion at the dawn of America. Their mystery now belongs to all of us, so we have to ask, what do you think happened to the lost colony? Share your own theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest enigma.
you.